My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 62 years old, and until 3 weeks ago I thought I understood my daughter's future in-laws. I was wrong. It happened at a dinner I almost didn't attend. My daughter Claire had been engaged to Thomas Bellamy for 8 months. The wedding was set for spring. His family had money, the kind that fills a room before anyone says a word. His father, Richard Bellamy, owned 3 car dealerships across the state. His mother, Margaret, wore pearls to a backyard barbecue. I owned a small hardware store on 5th Street. 31 years in the same building. I knew the name of every regular customer's dog. The dinner was at their house, a place with a circular driveway and a fountain that ran even in November. Claire had begged me to come. "Just be yourself, Dad," she said in the car. "They're going to love you." I didn't believe her, but I loved my daughter more than I doubted her judgment. Inside, the dining room smelled like rosemary and expensive candles. Richard shook my hand too firmly, like he was testing something. Margaret smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. Thomas sat next to Claire, looking nervous in a way I didn't understand yet. What none of them knew, what I had never told Claire or anyone in this town, really, was that I spent 4 years of my life in Lyon, France. My mother was born there. I lived with my grandmother from age 19 to 23, working in a bookbinding shop, learning a language that became, over time, as natural to me as English. When I came home to marry Claire's mother, I let that part of my life fold up quietly, like a letter put away in a drawer. It didn't fit the life I built here. A hardware store owner who spoke fluent French sounded like a joke nobody would believe. So, I never mentioned it. Not once, not even to Claire. That choice, the choice to stay quiet, was about to change everything. Dinner started normally enough. Richard talked about a golf trip to Scotland. Margaret asked polite, hollow questions about my store, the kind of questions people ask when they already know the answer doesn't matter to them. I answered, simply. I didn't reach for more than I had. Then, halfway through the meal, Richard's mother walked in. Thomas's grandmother, an elegant woman named Colette, who I later learned had been raised partly in Paris before her family immigrated. She sat at the head of the table like she owned the air around her. She looked at me for a long moment, studied my hands, my shirt, the way I held my fork. Then she turned to Margaret and said, in French, low enough that she thought no one else would catch the words, "Il ne sait même pas quelle fourchette utiliser. Comment Thomas a-t-il pu choisir une famille pareille? He doesn't even know which fork to use. How could Thomas choose a family like this?" My hand didn't move. My face didn't move. Something inside my chest went very still. The way water goes still right before it freezes. Margaret laughed. A small, careful laugh, the kind meant to stay inside the room. She replied, also in French, "Ne t'inquiète pas, ils ne dureront pas. Claire est jolie, mais son père, c'est un homme simple, un vendeur de clous. Don't worry, they won't last. Claire is pretty, but her father, he's a simple man, a nail salesman. A nail salesman, 31 years of building a business from nothing. 31 years of knowing every customer's name, of staying open during snowstorms because a widow down the street needed a furnace part, of paying for Claire's college with money I saved dollar by dollar behind that counter. Reduced to 4 words in a language they thought was a locked door. I picked up my water glass. My hand was steady. I want you to understand that. My hand was steady because by then I had already decided something. I would not let them know. Not yet. Claire didn't notice. She was laughing at something Thomas had said, her hand resting easily on his arm, her eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen since her mother passed 6 years earlier. My wife, Eleanor, died of ovarian cancer when Claire was 22. Since then, it had been just the 2 of us, a father and daughter, learning how to keep a house feel like a home with half the voices missing from it. Watching Claire laugh that night, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about me. It had never been about me. It was about whether these people, this family with their fountain and their pearls, would ever see my daughter as anything more than a pretty accessory to their son's life. I said nothing through the rest of dinner. I ate my food. I answered questions in short, simple sentences, giving them exactly the man they expected. Quiet, plain, a little slow maybe. Let them believe whatever made them comfortable. But inside, I was doing math. 4 years in Lyon. Every conversation in that bookbinding shop, every argument with my grandmother about politics, every love letter I'd once written in French to a girl whose face I could barely remember now, none of it wasted. All of it waiting, apparently, For a dinner table in a house with a fountain that ran in November, Colette spoke again near the end of the meal, this time to Thomas directly, still in French, still certain of her invisibility. Tu devrais réfléchir encore, mon chéri. Un mariage, ça ne s'annule pas facilement. You should think again, my dear. A marriage isn't easily undone. Thomas's jaw tightened. He glanced at Claire, then down at his plate. He didn't answer his grandmother, but he didn't defend Claire either. He didn't defend me. That silence told me something Claire hadn't seen yet, or hadn't let herself see. The dinner ended a little after 9. Richard walked us to the door with his firm handshake and his golf trip stories, playing the gracious host to the very end. Margaret kissed Claire on both cheeks and told her, in English this time, how wonderful it was to have her in the family. I shook her hand. I looked her directly in the eyes. Merci pour le dîner, I said. C'était délicieux. Thank you for dinner. It was delicious. I watched her face. I watched it change, the polite mask cracking for just a fraction of a second, like ice giving way under a boot. Margaret's smile froze. Her eyes moved quickly to Colette, then to Richard, then back to me, searching my face for a joke, an accident, anything except what she now understood to be true. I didn't wait for her to recover. I turned, took Claire's arm gently, and walked her to the car. What was that? Claire asked, as we pulled out of the driveway, her voice light, curious. Since when do you speak French? I looked at the fountain shrinking in the rearview mirror. Since before you were born, I said. There's a lot about me you don't know yet. Claire laughed, thinking I was joking. I let her think that. Some things you don't explain in a moving car with your daughter's future still hanging in the balance. But I knew. Driving home that night, under a sky heavy with the first snow of the season, that dinner had changed something permanent. Margaret and Colette had shown me exactly who they were. In the one moment they thought no one could understand them. And now I understood everything. The question wasn't whether I would tell Claire what her future family really thought of us. The question was when, and what I would do before that moment came, so that when the truth finally surfaced, my daughter wouldn't be standing alone. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, thinking about my grandmother in Lyon, about the language she gave me almost by accident, about how a gift you never think you'll use can turn out to be the exact tool you need, at the exact moment you need it most, somewhere across town, in a house with a fountain that never stopped running. I imagined Margaret Bellamy lying awake too, wondering how much I had understood and how much I would say. She had no idea I was already planning my next move. The days after that dinner passed strangely quiet. No calls from Margaret, no texts from Richard about golf or dealership expansions, just silence, thick and deliberate, the kind of silence that tells you people are talking about you behind closed doors. Claire noticed it too. Thomas's mom hasn't called me back in 4 days, she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning, stirring her coffee without drinking it. That's not like her. She usually calls about flowers or invitations or something. Maybe she's busy, I said. Claire looked at me carefully. She had her mother's eyes, sharp, patient, able to read a room before anyone spoke a word in it. Dad, what happened at that dinner? You've been different since then. I hadn't told her yet. I wasn't ready, not because I was protecting myself, but because I needed to understand the whole shape of this family before I handed my daughter a piece of it that might break her heart for nothing. If Thomas was different from his parents, if he was worth the risk, then I needed to know that first. Nothing happened, I said. Long day, that's all. She didn't believe me, but she let it go the way Shtez did when she sensed I needed room. Life went on. I opened the store at 7, same as always, restocked the nail bins, helped Mrs. Alvarez find the right washer for her kitchen faucet, listened to old man Griggs complain about the weather for 20 minutes before he bought a single bag of rock salt. This was my world. Small, steady, honest. Nobody here needed me to be anything other than what I was. It was Thomas who broke the silence first. He came into the store on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a jacket too clean for a hardware aisle, looking like a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and forgotten half of it the moment he walked through the door. Mr. Hensley, he said, do you have a minute? I set down the box of hinges I was sorting. Sure. He glanced around at the shelves, the register, the community corkboard covered in flyers for lost cats and piano lessons. For a moment, I saw something honest cross his face, Not embarrassment, but a kind of recognition, like he was seeing something real for the first time in a long while. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to be honest with me." "I generally am." "Did something happen at dinner? With my grandmother? My mother?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "They've been acting strange. My mom keeps asking me if you seemed offended." There it was. The crack starting to show. I studied him for a moment, this young man who wanted to marry my daughter, who was standing in my store instead of demanding answers from his own family first. That told me something. "Sit down," I said, nodding toward the 2 stools by the counter. "I'll tell you exactly what happened." I told him everything. Colette's words, Margaret's laugh. The phrase that had lodged itself behind my ribs like a splinter, un vendeur de clous, a nail salesman. I kept my voice even factual the way I'd report a leak in a customer's roof, just the facts. No drama. Thomas's face went pale. Then red, then something harder to name, a mixture of shame and anger that seemed too old for his 28 years. "They said that," he repeated, "not a question. They did, and you understood every word, every word." He sat there for a long moment, staring at the scarred wood of my counter, the one I'd refinished myself 12 years ago after a customer's cart scratched it during a busy Saturday. Finally, he said quietly, "I'm sorry. That's not who I want to be. That's not who I thought Claire was marrying into." "I believe you," I said. And I did mostly. But belief isn't the same as certainty, and I had learned a long time ago that people show you who they are through what they do next, not what they say in the heat of an apology. "What are you going to do?" Thomas asked. "Nothing for now," I said. "This isn't my fight to start. It's yours if you want it to be. Your family. Your choice about what kind of son you're going to be." He nodded slowly and left without buying anything, which was fine. Some visits aren't about hardware. 2 weeks later, Margaret called Claire and invited us both to a smaller family dinner. No Colette this time, just Richard, Margaret, Thomas, Claire, and me. Claire was thrilled. She thought it meant things were healing. I wasn't so sure. I had learned, in 31 years of reading people across a hardware counter, that a sudden invitation after a long silence usually means someone has decided on damage control, not honesty. I was right. The dinner started stiffly. Margaret was overly warm, complimenting my tie, asking about the store with what looked like genuine effort this time. Richard talked less about golf and more about how important family harmony is as we move toward the wedding. It sounded rehearsed, like a speech written by a lawyer instead of a mother. Then, near dessert, Margaret set down her wine glass and looked at me with careful, practiced eyes. "Walter," she said, "I want to apologize if anything was said at Colette's dinner that came across the wrong way. My mother-in-law can be old-fashioned, set in her ways. I hope you didn't take anything too personally. Too personally, as if calling me a simple man, a nail salesman, unworthy of my own daughter's happiness, was a matter of tone rather than truth." I set my fork down gently. "Margaret," I said, "I understood every word you said that night. Not just Colette's, yours too." The table went silent. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Claire's eyes moved rapidly between her father and her future mother-in-law, confusion and dawning horror crossing her face in equal measure. "What is he talking about?" Claire asked, her voice small. Margaret's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Walter, I don't know what you said I was a simple man," I continued, my voice calm, steady. The same voice I used to calm a frightened customer during a power outage, a nail salesman. "You said Claire was pretty, but the marriage wouldn't last because of who her father was. You said it in French because you assumed I couldn't understand you." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. "Dad," she whispered, "is that true?" "Every word," I said, not looking away from Margaret. "I spent 4 years in Lyon as a young man. I understood everything that was said at that table, both times." Outside, rain had started against the windows, soft at first, then heavier, drumming a rhythm against the glass that filled the silence. Nobody at that table seemed capable of filling themselves. Richard set down his napkin, his face hard now, the golf trip charm completely gone. "Margaret, is this true?" "Richard." It was one comment, taken out of context. There were 2 comments, and yours. I remember them precisely. Claire stood up so fast. Her chair nearly tipped backward. Thomas reached for her hand, but she pulled away, tears already gathering in her eyes. Not sad tears, I realized. Angry ones. "You sat there," Claire said to Margaret, her voice shaking, smiling at me, kissing my cheeks, telling me how wonderful it was to have me in the family, while thinking my father was some kind of joke, while planning for my marriage to fail? Claire, please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Claire said. I heard exactly what my father heard. Just later, she grabbed her coat from the back of the chair. I stood to follow her, but she held up a hand, not against me, but asking for a moment, a beat of dignity she needed to hold on to by herself. Thomas, she said, turning to him. Her voice was quieter now, but it cut sharper than her anger had. Did you know? When you came to my dad's store, did you already know what they said? And you let me keep planning a wedding without telling me? Thomas's silence answered before his words did. I wanted to fix it first, he finally said. I wanted to talk to them, make sure it wouldn't happen again Before you what? Before you decided whether I was worth defending? Nobody at that table had an answer for her. Claire looked at me then, and for a moment I saw my late wife in her face. That same fierce, unwavering clarity Eleanor used to carry into every hard conversation of our marriage. Take me home, Dad, Claire said. I walked her out into the rain without another word to the Bellamys. Behind us, I heard Richard's voice rising, sharp and furious, directed at his wife. Whatever consequences were coming for Margaret inside that house, they weren't mine to manage anymore. In the car, Claire sat with her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the wet, blurred streetlights sliding past the window. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She finally asked, her voice raw. Because I needed to know if this family was worth fighting for, before I broke your heart over people who might not deserve the weight of it, I said. And because some truths you can't hand to your child. You have to let them find their own way to see it. She was quiet for a long time. Then softly she said, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I didn't have an answer for her yet, not really. But I reached over and took her hand, the way I used to when she was small and afraid of the dark, and I told her the only thing I knew for certain. Whatever you decide, you won't be deciding it alone. Neither of us knew it yet, but the real storm hadn't even started. Somewhere behind us, in that house, with the fountain and the pearls, Margaret Bellamy was about to make a decision that would reveal exactly how far this family was willing to go to protect their name, and how much they were willing to sacrifice to do it. Claire didn't answer any of Thomas's calls for 4 days. I watched her from a distance during that stretch, the way a father learns to watch a grown daughter, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough to let her walk on her own. She went to work at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. She came home, made dinner, sat on the porch some evenings with a mug of tea going cold in her hands. She didn't cry in front of me. I suspected she cried plenty when I wasn't looking. On the 5th day, Thomas showed up at her apartment. I know because Claire told me about it afterward, sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where this whole thing had started to unravel weeks earlier. He said he wants to fix it, Claire told me. He said he confronted his mother, that he told her if she couldn't respect you, she didn't deserve to be at the wedding. What do you think? I asked. I think. Claire wrapped her hands around her cup. I think I want to believe him, but I keep thinking about that silence at dinner, the moment he didn't say anything right when it mattered. I understood that better than she knew. Silence, in my experience, tells you more about a person than the words they choose when they finally decide to speak. Give him a chance to show you, not tell you, I said. Actions carry weight that words don't. A week later, we learned exactly what kind of weight Margaret Bellamy was willing to throw around. Claire called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since her mother's funeral. Dad, you need to come over, now. I drove across town faster than I should have, my mind running through every terrible possibility a father imagines when his daughter says those words. When I got there, Claire was sitting at her small kitchen table, a printed letter in front of her, her hands shaking slightly as she slid it toward me. It was from a lawyer's office, Bellamy Family Legal Counsel. The letter was carefully worded, full of phrases like, in light of recent developments, and concerns regarding compatibility of families. Underneath the polite legal language, the message was simple and cruel. The Bellamys were requesting a prenuptial agreement so restrictive that, in the event of a divorce, Claire would leave the marriage with nothing. No assets, no support, nothing from the 8 years she and Thomas might build together. It even included a clause about family reputation protection that would prevent her from ever discussing the Bellamy family publicly. under threat of significant financial penalty. They're trying to buy their silence, I said quietly, reading it a second time, and insure themselves against you like you're a liability instead of their son's future wife. Thomas says he didn't know about this, Claire said. He says his father did this without telling him. Do you believe him? Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I don't know anymore. That's the problem. I made a decision that night that I hadn't fully thought through, but that felt necessary the way certain decisions do. Not logical exactly, but true. I called an old friend, Daniel Osei, a lawyer I'd known since we were both young men just starting out. Him building a practice, me building a hardware store, both of us learning how hard it is to build something honest in a world that doesn't always reward honesty. Daniel had helped me with the store's contracts for decades. I trusted him the way you trust very few people in life. I need your help, I told him over the phone. Not for me, for my daughter. 2 days later, Claire and I sat in Daniel's office, the letter from the Bellamy family lawyers spread across his desk. This document isn't just protective, Daniel said, tapping the page. It's punitive. It's designed to make her feel small enough that she either walks away from the marriage entirely or accepts terms that would leave her financially vulnerable for the rest of her life if things went wrong. This isn't standard prenup language. This is a message. What message? Claire asked. That you don't matter as much as their name does, Daniel said simply. That protecting the Bellamy reputation is worth more to them than protecting you. Claire sat very still, absorbing that. I watched something shift behind her eyes, grief settling into resolve, the way it eventually does if you give it enough time, and the right kind of company. I want to respond, she said finally. Not run away, respond. I felt something like pride move through my chest, sharp and warm. My daughter, Eleanor's daughter, finding her spine in a lawyer's office instead of letting herself be quietly erased by people who thought money made them untouchable. Claire requested one more dinner with the Bellamy family. Just the two of them, and me, and this time Daniel came too, not to intimidate anyone, but simply to make sure the conversation happened on honest ground. Richard opened the door himself this time, his usual golf trip charm entirely absent. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her eyes avoiding mine. Colette was not present. I noticed that immediately and filed it away as information. Let's not waste time, Claire said. Before anyone could offer polite, hollow small talk, she placed the prenup document on the table. I know what this is. I know what it's meant to do. Richard cleared his throat. Claire, it's simply prudent, given the circumstances. To protect what exactly? Claire interrupted, her voice steady in a way that made me proud and afraid for her in equal measure. Your money, or the fact that your wife and mother-in-law think my father is beneath this family? Margaret's face flushed. That is not what this is about, isn't it? Claire looked directly at her. You called my father a nail salesman. You said this marriage wouldn't last because of who he is. And a month later, your lawyers send a document designed to make sure that if it doesn't last, I walk away with nothing. That's not prudence. That's punishment, dressed up in legal language. The room went silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind us. Thomas, sitting beside his mother, finally spoke, his voice low but firm, firmer than I'd heard it before. Mom, Dad, this has to stop. I love Claire. I'm not signing anything that treats her like a threat to manage instead of the woman I'm marrying. Richard's jaw tightened. Thomas, you don't understand the kind of money that's at stake if… I understand exactly what's at stake, Thomas said. My future. And right now, I'm more concerned about losing that than losing money I haven't even inherited yet. Margaret's composure finally cracked, her voice rising with something between anger and desperation. You have no idea what it's like, watching your only son choose a life so far beneath what he was raised for. I did what any mother would do to protect. Don't, Claire said, cutting her off, her voice suddenly sharp as glass. Don't you dare finish that sentence in front of my father. I hadn't planned to speak. I had told myself I would let Claire lead this conversation, that this was her fight to have on her own terms. But something in that moment pulled the words out of me before I could stop them. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a small, worn photograph on the table, one I had carried with me that evening, almost by instinct. It showed a young man in a bookbinder's apron, standing outside a shop in Lyon, arms crossed, squinting against the sun. 22 years old. Confident, A world away from a hardware store in a small American town. Margaret, I said. You looked at me across that first dinner table and decided you already knew everything about who I was. A simple man. A nail salesman. You weren't wrong that I sell hardware for a living, but you were wrong about everything else. I slid the photograph toward her. I could tell you about the 4 years I spent in France, the grandmother who raised me there, the languages, the books I bound with my own hands before I ever touched a cash register. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is that you decided my worth before you knew a single true thing about me, and you were willing to hurt my daughter to protect your idea of what her life should look like, instead of trusting her to build a life of her own. Margaret stared at the photograph, then at me, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. I never meant. You did mean it, I said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. You meant every word in the moment you said it. What you didn't mean was to be caught. The dinner ended without resolution. Richard folded the legal document back into its envelope, his expression unreadable. Margaret left the table before dessert was served, disappearing into another room without another word. Thomas walked Claire and me to the door, his face pale, his hands unsteady. I don't know what happens now, he admitted quietly, standing under the porch light while rain began to fall again, steady and cold. But I know I'm not going to let my family's pride cost me the person I love. Claire studied him for a long moment. Prove it, she said. Not with words, with what you do next. We drove home in silence, the rain drumming against the windshield, the wipers marking time like a slow, uncertain heartbeat. 3 days later, everything changed. Daniel called me early on a Monday morning, his voice tight with something I hadn't heard from him before in all our years of friendship. Genuine alarm. Walter, he said, you need to sit down. There's something in the Bellamy family's financial history that's about to become public, and it's going to change everything you think you understand about why Margaret was so desperate to protect this marriage's terms. What is it? I asked. It's not about Claire, Daniel said. It never was. It's about money that's been missing from Richard's dealerships for almost 3 years, and evidence suggesting Margaret has known about it the entire time. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and understood in that moment that everything we thought we knew about that family, their wealth, their judgment, their carefully guarded reputation, was about to come apart at the seams. And somehow, my daughter was standing right in the middle of it. Daniel asked me to come to his office that same afternoon. Claire insisted on coming with me, and I didn't argue. Whatever this was, it belonged to her now as much as it belonged to me. Walk us through it, I said. Once we were seated across from his desk, Daniel opened a folder, spreading a series of documents across the surface: bank statements, dealership financial records, emails that had clearly been forwarded to him through channels he didn't fully explain, and didn't need to. Richard's dealerships have been profitable on paper for years, Daniel said. But nearly 3 years ago, discrepancies started showing up in the accounting. Money moving out in small amounts, routed through vendor accounts that don't actually exist, slow enough that it wouldn't trigger obvious alarms, fast enough that over time, it added up to just over $800,000. Claire leaned forward, frowning. Embezzlement, that's what it looks like, Daniel said. And here's the part that matters to you both. The account receiving those funds isn't Richard's. It's registered under Margaret's maiden name. The room went quiet. I thought back to that first dinner, to Margaret's careful, controlled elegance, her pearls, her polite, hollow questions. I thought about the prenuptial agreement, the punitive terms, the clause demanding Claire's silence about the family, under threat of financial penalty. She wasn't protecting the family's reputation, I said slowly, understanding arriving like cold water. She was protecting a secret. If Claire ever became suspicious of the family's finances, if a divorce ever led to discovery during asset disclosure, she'd be exposed, Daniel finished. The prenup wasn't really about you being beneath the family, Walter. That was real. That judgment was real. But the aggressive terms, the silence clause, that was about making sure nobody ever had a legal reason to look closely at where the family's money actually was. Claire sat back in her chair, her face pale. Does Thomas know? Based on what I've seen, Daniel said carefully, I don't believe he does. There's no indication his name is connected to any of these accounts. I felt some small relief at that, though I kept it guarded. Trust, once damaged, doesn't repair itself just because new information arrives. It has to be rebuilt slowly, one true thing at a time. How did you get all this? Claire asked. Daniel hesitated. A former bookkeeper at one of the dealerships reached out to a colleague of mine 2 months ago. She'd been fired suddenly. After raising questions internally, she suspected retaliation. She's been building a case ever since, hoping someone would eventually listen. When your father mentioned the Bellamy name in connection with this situation, I recognized it immediately. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table, turning the small photograph of myself in Lyon over in my hands, the one I'd shown Margaret at dinner. I thought about how strange it was that a piece of my past, something I'd folded away and nearly forgotten, had become the thread that unraveled a much larger and darker secret than anyone at that dinner table could have imagined. Claire called around 9 that night. I told Thomas, she said. Everything. About the accounts, about his mother's name on them. How did he take it? He didn't believe me at first. Then he got very quiet. She paused. Dad, he's going to confront them. Tonight. He asked me not to come, but I don't think I can just sit here waiting. Then don't, I said, but go as yourself, not as someone trying to fix his family for him. This isn't your burden to carry. I drove Claire to the Bellamy house that night, though I stayed in the car at her request, engine running, headlights cutting through the steady rain that seemed to follow this family, everywhere their secrets went. Through the front window, I could see shapes moving. Richard, Margaret, Thomas, voices raised, though I couldn't make out the words from where I sat. Claire told me everything afterward, once she climbed back into the car, soaked and shaking, not from cold. Thomas had confronted his mother directly, laying Daniel's documents on the same dining table where Colette had once whispered her cruel judgment in a language she thought was safe. Margaret had denied it first. Then, faced with account numbers and dates she couldn't explain away, she had broken down completely. She said she did it to protect us. Claire told me, her voice hollow with disbelief, that Richard's dealerships had been struggling more than anyone knew, that she was quietly building a safety net in case everything collapsed. She said she never meant to steal from him, that legally, as his wife, she felt entitled to protect her share before the company potentially went under. Does Richard believe that? I don't know. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Claire wiped her eyes. Thomas told them both that he was done being controlled by their fear. He said he loves me, and he's not going to let his mother's mistakes or his father's pride decide what happens to us. 2 weeks passed in a strange, uncertain quiet. Richard filed for a formal audit of both dealerships and, on Daniel's advice, brought in independent legal counsel, separate from the family's usual lawyers, to review whether criminal charges would be pursued against Margaret. Word began to spread, slowly at first, then faster, the way news does in a town where everyone knows someone who works somewhere connected to somewhere else. I watched the Bellamy name, once spoken with a kind of automatic respect, become something people whispered about with narrowed eyes instead. I felt no satisfaction in that. I want to be honest about that. There is a kind of person who might have relished watching a family that humiliated him crumble under the weight of their own secrets. I wasn't that man, and I didn't want to become him. I thought instead about Margaret's face at that second dinner, defensive and frightened, and I understood. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of clarity. People who build their lives around protecting an image usually do it because somewhere underneath that image, they're afraid of what they'd be without it. That didn't excuse what she'd said about me. It didn't excuse the prenup, or the silence clause, or the casual cruelty of assuming a nail salesman's daughter wasn't worth honest treatment. But it explained it. There's a difference between excusing something and understanding it. Claire came to my house one evening near the end of those 2 weeks, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where this had all unfolded, piece by piece. Thomas asked me something today, she said. He asked if I still wanted to marry him. Given everything, what did you tell him? I told him I needed to know who he was without his family's money and reputation standing behind him. I told him I needed to see him choose honesty over comfort, more than once, before I could trust it wasn't just a moment of crisis talking. I nodded slowly. That sounds like your mother's daughter. Claire almost smiled at that, the first real almost smile I'd seen from her in weeks. He said he understood. He said he wanted the chance to prove it however long that takes. And what do you want? Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. I want to believe that people can be more than the family that raised them, she finally. You were, Dad. You built something honest out of a life that could have gone a lot of different ways. I have to believe Thomas can do the same, if I'm ever going to trust this is real. I reached across the table and took her hand, the way I had in the car weeks earlier, in the rain, when none of us yet knew how deep this all went. Then give him the room to prove it, I said. Just don't let anyone, not him, not his family, not even me, make that choice for you. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Through the kitchen window, I could see the first clear night sky in nearly 2 weeks. Stars scattered across the dark like something patiently waiting to be noticed again. Neither of us knew yet how the audit would end, whether Margaret would face real consequences, or whether Thomas would find the strength to build a life separate from his family's fear and pride. But for the first time since that first dinner months earlier, I felt something like hope settle quietly into the space where dread had been living. The truth had finally surfaced. What we built from it, that part was still ours to decide. Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it does after a long winter, a little at a time, until one morning you step outside and realize the cold has actually broken. The audit into Richard's dealerships took 11 weeks. Daniel kept us updated when he legally could, though most of what happened during that stretch unfolded in rooms Claire and I weren't part of. What we learned, eventually, was this. Margaret had moved just over $800,000 into hidden accounts over 3 years, technically without Richard's knowledge, though the investigators noted he'd been willfully blind to warning signs for at least half that time, too consumed by appearances to ask hard questions about his own company's books. Margaret wasn't charged criminally. The dealerships were privately held, and Richard, after long deliberation, chose not to pursue prosecution against his own wife, a decision that cost him something with Thomas, who felt his father was once again choosing reputation over truth. He didn't want the story in the papers, Thomas told Claire, and Claire told me, during one of the many conversations we started having again over dinner at my kitchen table. He'd rather absorb the loss quietly than let anyone outside the family know how badly things had actually cracked. I understood that impulse, even if I didn't respect it. Some people spend their whole lives protecting a version of themselves that was never entirely true to begin with. Thomas started coming to my store on Saturday mornings, not to talk about weddings or family drama, but simply to work. He didn't ask for a job. He just showed up the first time, awkward in his expensive jacket, and asked if there was something he could help carry. I put him to work unloading a truck of lumber and fencing supplies. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that, until it became something neither of us discussed out loud, an understanding built quietly, the way most real trust gets built. Why do you keep coming back? I finally asked him, maybe 2 months in. As we stacked paint cans onto a display shelf, Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. Because this is the first honest work I've ever done, he said. My whole life, everything came easy because of my father's name. I never had to prove I could actually build anything. I want to know what that feels like before I ask Claire to build a life with me. I looked at him for a long moment. This young man with soft hands slowly turning rough from real labor, and I saw something in him that reminded me, distantly, of the boy I used to be, the one who left for Lyon at 19 with almost nothing, trying to figure out who he was outside of what his family expected. That's a good place to start, I told him. Claire and Thomas didn't rush back into wedding planning. They took their time, nearly a year, in the end, rebuilding something that had cracked under the weight of secrets and cruelty neither of them had chosen but both had to reckon with. During that year, something unexpected happened. Margaret asked to meet with me, alone, at a small coffee shop downtown instead of the house with the fountain. She looked different than she had at that first dinner. Smaller, somehow, stripped of the practiced elegance that used to surround her like armor. I owe you an apology, she said, before I'd even finished sitting down. Not the kind I gave before, wrapped up in excuses about my mother-in-law being old-fashioned. A real one. I waited. I looked at you that first night and decided I already knew your whole life, she continued, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. A man who sells nails for a living. I built an entire story about what that meant about your worth, and I was so certain of it that I said cruel things out loud. in a language I assumed made me safe. I was wrong about you, and if I'm honest, Walter, I think I was using judgment of you to distract from how frightened I was of my own life falling apart. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because Thomas told me something last week that I couldn't stop thinking about, Margaret said. He said watching you work all these months, showing up every day, building something real with your own hands, teaching him what honest effort actually looks like, taught him more about the kind of man he wants to be than I ever did, with all our money and all our careful appearances. I didn't say anything right away. Forgiveness isn't a door that opens all at once. It's more like a series of small, deliberate steps taken slowly, over time, and I wasn't sure yet how many of those steps I was willing to take with Margaret Bellamy. I don't need an apology to know my own worth, I finally said. I knew that before I ever sat at your dinner table, but I appreciate you saying it, and I hope, for your son's sake, that you mean it enough to actually change. The wedding happened the following June, in a small garden behind Claire's favorite restaurant. Nothing like the grand affair the Bellamys had originally imagined. Richard paid for very little of it, at Thomas's insistence. He wanted this celebration built on what he and Claire had earned honestly during that hard year, not what his family's money could buy. I walked Claire down a short aisle lined with folding chairs and wildflowers. Her mother's pearl earrings, the only pearls that mattered to either of us, catching the early evening light. "You look like your mother," I whispered to her, just before we started walking. "I hope I make her proud," Claire whispered back. "You already have." At the reception, Colette approached me. The same woman whose careless words in a language she thought was safe had set this entire chain of events into motion nearly 2 years earlier. She looked older than I remembered, more careful in the way she held herself. "I owe you an apology too," she said in English this time, deliberately. "I misjudged you the moment I saw you. I'm sorry for that." "Apology accepted," I said, and I meant it, mostly, not because the wound didn't matter, but because holding on to it forever would have cost me more than it cost her. Claire and Thomas built their life quietly after that. A small house, not a mansion with a fountain, close enough that Claire could still stop by my store on her lunch breaks, the way she used to, as a little girl, swinging her legs on the same stool by the counter. Thomas eventually left his father's dealerships entirely. He took a job managing operations for a small local manufacturing company, work that felt honest to him in a way his family's business never had. Richard and Margaret's marriage survived technically, though something in it had permanently shifted, a fragile peace built more on necessity than trust. One evening, almost 2 years after that first dinner where everything began, Claire sat with me on my porch, watching the sun go down over the same street I'd walked for 3 decades. "Do you ever regret staying quiet that first night?" she asked. "Not telling them right away that you understood?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "No," I said. "If I'd exposed them immediately, out of anger, I don't think you would have seen who they really were underneath the performance. Sometimes the truth needs room to surface on its own timing, not ours. What I regret is not telling you sooner what I'd heard. I was trying to protect you, but I ended up making the decision for you, instead of trusting you to handle it." Claire leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she used to as a child. "You gave me the truth as soon as you understood the whole shape of it," she said. "That's not the same as hiding it. That's just being careful with something you love." We sat there together as the streetlights came on, one by one, down the length of the road I'd spent my whole life walking. I thought about my grandmother in Lyon, about the language she gave me almost as an afterthought, never imagining it would one day protect her great-granddaughter from a family who mistook silence for ignorance and money for worth. Some inheritances aren't written into wills. Some of them are quieter than that. A language, a work ethic, a refusal to let other people's cruelty define your value. My grandmother gave me French almost by accident. I'd given Claire something else, something I hadn't fully realized until I watched her stand at that second dinner table, spine straight, refusing to be small for people who had decided, wrongly, that she and her father were beneath them. They had never asked if I understood French. They never imagined that understanding would be the thing that saved my daughter's future, instead of destroying it.